how a Virginia power company is trying to discourage gun owners from voting, and an interview with Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and get a membership today to get access to exclusive posts and exclusive reporting, exclusive analysis, stuff you will literally not get anywhere else, no matter where you look. And you'll also get early access to this here podcast, plus the chance to be on the podcast if you'd like. We've had some really nice segments where we've had Reload members on who kind of explain who they are, their background, how they got into potentially into owning firearms or in the firearms industry in some way, and you know how they came across the Reload and what made them join, those sorts of things. I always find those really interesting. So by the way, if you are already a Reload member, feel free to respond to your Sunday newsletter, your exclusive analysis newsletter that you get every Sunday, and let us know that you want to be on the show, and we'll have you on. I think that those are, like I said, some of the best segments we do on this show. But this week, we are talking with contributing writer Jake Fogelman about the latest developments in the gun world. First up, we have the Virginia gubernatorial election, which has been the source of some recent controversy. Is that right, Jake?
Yeah. So covered a couple stories here about Terry McAuliffe, and it came out that Dominion Energy, which is a major power company in Virginia, was contributing $200,000 to a recently created PAC, Virginia Accountability PAC, and that group was running sort of shadowy ads in Republican strongholds in the state, basically calling Glenn Youngkin a squish on gun rights issues, ostensibly to depress turnout in those areas for people turning out to race. And it's notable because McAuliffe publicly swore off of funding from Dominion, and so this kind of end run around that is very interesting and very, very suspicious.
Yeah, very underhanded. Not like a completely unheard of thing to do in politics, certainly. Sure. But it's one of those things that's very sleazy. I think most people view it as very underhanded and unfortunately more common than everyone would like, which is kind of what turns a lot of people off from politics, is exactly this kind of stuff. And the Absolutely. CEO, Robert Blue, came out and said that Dominion they had no idea what was going on. They didn't know that this money was going to go towards ads that were pretending to be from, a gun rights group, when really the group is founded and run by a progressive consulting firm, a liberal consulting firm, and which raises its money through Act Blue, which is the largest liberal fundraising network in the country. Very clearly, I think to anyone paying attention, they are not a legitimate gun rights group. Now, they do latch on to a legitimate complaint about the Republican in this race, Glenn Youngkin, where he hasn't sought out the endorsements of the gun rights groups, the NRA or the VCDL. He's refused to fill out their election surveys, so they won't endorse him. Now that does seem to be something of a intentional strategy on Youngkin's part to maybe avoid. He's trying to sort of walk the tightrope when it comes to a number of things. Donald Trump, he's kind of kept him at arm's length, but not rejected him entirely, right? Which has upset Trump to some degree. But it seems to be working at least well enough to keep him in the single digits range of Terry McAuliffe, the former Democratic governor here. Virginia has a weird system where governors can only serve for one term at a time, but they can later on run to be governor again if they'd like, which is exactly what's happening here. McAuliffe was the previous governor before Northam, who's also a Democrat, and then Northam can't run again. Not that he probably would at this point, given the whole blackface scandal, where he was caught wearing blackface in a picture in his one of his college yearbooks. but he didn't resign and has stayed on. But he can't seek re-election at this point regardless. So McAuliffe came back in to do it instead. And yes, like you said, he swore off donations from Dominion Energy, which is like a $62 billion utility company that operates in like 6 or 7 different states. But, as you can probably tell from the name, is most associated with Virginia, where it provides most of the power to most people in the state. And I think that also underscores another reason people find this very distasteful, which is that Dominion is a utility. You cannot just buy a different power company in Virginia. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. My power is from Dominion here in Alexandria, Virginia, and I couldn't just tell my apartment complex to switch power, suppliers. That's not how it works. So I think people don't like the idea of them meddling in this, especially in this way, frankly, because they're doing it. They're clearly trying to get around, like you mentioned, McAuliffe's whole declaration that he wouldn't take money from them. They obviously want him to win over Youngkin for whatever reason. Maybe they believe that McAuliffe will give them more incentives for certain programs, maybe green energy programs that they're involved with, or whatever the reason is.
Yeah, who knows?
They clearly prefer McAuliffe to Youngkin, and this is just the most backdoor sort of shady way of trying to influence the race. And their excuse that they just didn't know what was going to happen with this money they gave this group. Right. It's not remotely credible because this group, they said, I guess Blue says, we knew these guys that were making this PAC, right? So the consulting firm, I guess they're familiar with. But supposedly they didn't know what they were going to do with the money. They didn't know they were going to basically disingenuously attack Glenn Youngkin from the right on guns yes, Glenn Youngkin has not been endorsed by these gun rights groups, but he's clearly far more pro-gun or in favor of fewer new restrictions than Terry McAuliffe is. That's not really no question on that. It's more of a question of whether he would fill out the surveys and whether he'll follow through on the things that he says. He supports, he's against an assault weapons ban, but if there's obviously real questions. That's how these attacks work. You take some legitimate concern or criticism of someone and you latch onto that, but you're doing it in a way that by people who are obviously disingenuous about that concern. Because if you were worried about gun rights in this campaign, right, as the actual gun rights groups are, the NRA and VCDL, you would also be criticizing at the very least, you would also criticize Terry McAuliffe for his very strong stances on wanting to implement even more gun restrictions than what was just implemented in the last session of the State House here in Virginia. So McAuliffe is very open about supporting an assault weapons ban. He supported assault weapons confiscation, AR-15s, AK-47s, guns like that, very popular firearms. He wants to confiscate them, is what the Democrats had proposed repeatedly over the last several years and what McAuliffe has supported in the past. Now, I think his stated position on his campaign website is just opposing the sale of, these sorts of firearms. But in the past, he's been on board with confiscation efforts as well. They didn't get into law, but he was supported them. And so, if you're going to be concerned about gun rights in this race, you obviously can't just criticize Youngkin. You can criticize him for not, and VCDL and others have criticized him for not being more stringent on the issue, being more open about his where he stands and making it more of a primary issue in his campaign. But as VCDL and others have pointed out, the policy differences are stark and obvious and clear when you look at them. So when Dominion comes along and gives money to this group who disingenuously is attacking Youngkin from the right on guns and says they didn't know what was going to happen. It's just kind of a joke.
Sure.
Like, to be honest, to be completely honest about the whole thing. I obviously do my best not to opine so much on this podcast or in my writing, but sometimes there's just things that are so ridiculous that I can't help it. It's, this group was founded in July of 2021. The idea that they came around and just found this group, didn't know what the heck it was, didn't know what it was going to do, and gave them six figures is laughable. And if it were true, it wouldn't make them look any better. It'd make them look very stupid, frankly. I guess they're playing ignorant here, and it's not a good look one way or the other.
Right. And as you said, you're a Virginia gun owner. You have no choice but to pay money to these people. I mean, how does that make you feel as a gun owner to sit there and say, look, this company that I have to give money to keep the lights on is now publicly campaigning to elect a guy that wants to take away my gun rights? So as you said, it is kind of a joke. It's a wild situation.
Oh, it certainly is. But we'll have more on that in the newsletter this week as well. And on, the idea of where guns is going to come down as far as importance in this election. The candidates have really focused on other things so far. And we're going to get more into this with Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms here in a moment in the interview. But with the race this close, I think even though Youngkin and McAuliffe have focused on different issues primarily throughout the race, anything can have a real impact. So, but we'll get into that more with Cam. What else I wanted to talk to you about specifically was your piece on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's recent ruling. It's another place that's dear to my heart. I'm from Pennsylvania originally. For anyone who didn't realize this, who follows me on Twitter and sees all of the Philly sports tweets, those are I was born into that torture, so that's why that happens. But so Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they had a big ruling today on preemption laws. Is that this week on preemption laws? Is that right?
Yeah, there was a big ruling. So the whole case centered around the issue of standing. So typically, in order to bring a suit against one of these laws, you have to have been a victim of prosecution under these laws. That's traditionally how it's been understood. But the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in this case that the law itself existing and the nature of someone being a gun owner in that jurisdiction was sufficient enough that you can bring standing to sue against those laws. So in this case, Harrisburg had, I think, 4 ordinances that were under question. Things like there was a ban in city parks on possessing a firearm, discharging your firearm outside of designated gun ranges. There's a mandatory reporting if you lost or had your firearm stolen. So things like that a local gun group was suing against. And and
the issue there, right, is that in Pennsylvania, there's a state law that says, is in a lot of states now, that says localities can't pass these kinds of restrictions that go further than what the state law is, right?
That's correct, yeah. So they're one of 42 states that have a very robust preemption law that essentially says, can't be stricter than what the state mandates. And that's pretty significant in Pennsylvania. They've had several battles over the years where big cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia will try to test the limits and pass a law, and they almost always end up getting struck down under that preemption statute. So it'll be interesting to see going forward with this new ruling if more gun owners are now able to bring suits against anytime one of these cities tries to pass new gun laws.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially because some of those ordinances are ones that Philadelphia has, like that park ban, guns in the park ban. They often will get struck down in court. But the hiccup here is that a lot of these places will pass these laws and then never prosecute anyone for them. I think Pittsburgh was trying to do something like this. And then they actually were threatened with legal action from the district attorney out there for trying to pursue illegal laws, basically, or laws that would violate the state preemption bill. And this fight has actually, been pretty hot the last couple of years throughout the country, right? Not just in Pennsylvania, although it has been hot in Pennsylvania too. For instance, Philadelphia's concealed carry permit application process has been called into question a number of times because they keep adding new requirements that go beyond what state law requires, and they keep getting sued over that.
Right.
So it's certainly been something that's come up a number of times in Pennsylvania, but it's also come up across the country. I mean, really, this is a fairly new protection for gun rights that didn't exist, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
Most states didn't have these kinds of preemption laws. And the complaint was that you could, within a state, you could have a dozen, 2 dozen different restrictions on firearms. And if you travel throughout that state, you might be a felon in one county and not in another. So it was they call it like a spider web of laws. And that this was the main complaint that people had on the gun rights side of the issue about the situation. And so a lot like concealed carry permits, they went about and had a grassroots campaign to change these laws throughout the country and institute preemption laws that made it so the gun laws in each state were uniform, so that you could at least have an understanding from state to state what was illegal and what was not.
Sure.
And so recently, you've seen a number of, and I think you're going to write a bit more about this too. It'll probably be out by the time this podcast goes up. But recently, you've seen gun control advocates challenging these preemption laws throughout the country as well by trying to get localities to pass stricter provisions within their own authority and then challenge them in court. And they've actually lost quite a lot of those. That hasn't been a very successful tactic in recent years for the gun control community. And now you're actually seeing them go back towards legislation because they have had some success in recent years.
Yeah, my home state of Colorado. Yeah,
both our home states. Yeah,
that's right.
Colorado, Virginia
would be. The city of Boulder had an assault weapons ban that was struck down under our preemption law this spring. And then after that tragic shooting at the King Soopers that happened there, it just galvanized the state legislature and we completely did away with our preemption statute. So now it's free reign for localities to pass any gun law that they want, so long as it's not less strict than the state.
Yeah. And Virginia chipped away at its preemption law just recently as part of the package that Democrats passed in 2020, where basically localities can create their own regulations over where people are allowed to carry guns. So inside local government buildings, at parks, or inside parks, similar to what Harrisburg and Philadelphia have implemented illegally up in Pennsylvania. Now localities can do that legally here. They can restrict guns from parks and from permitted events or events that should be permitted, whatever that means.
Yeah.
So like protests or large gatherings of people that don't have permits to gather. So, it's certainly become an issue here in Alexandria specifically, where I live. They've banned guns in all the parks. They put up signs and so forth. And so it's not as extreme as what they did in Colorado, which was, removing all preemption protections. But so you have seen some success for the gun control side of things on that front, limited success in a couple of states on rolling back these preemption protections. So it'll be interesting to see what this Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling does for the state. That's been a big fight up there for a while now. They even passed a law that would have allowed gun rights groups to sue of their own volition, but that got caught up in basically technicalities of how it was passed, not the law itself, but the way they passed it was deemed to be not in compliance with state constitution. So they weren't able to put that into effect. But now it seems like you're going to see a lot more of these suits. But sure, it'll be interesting to watch. We'll keep an eye on it for sure. But anyway, we've got a great interview with Cam Edwards, Bearing Arms, coming up. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Virginia elections and how some of these Dominion shenanigans have played out, and what it actually looks like is going to happen in about a week here when Virginians head to the polls. So stay tuned for that. I'm here with Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. Cam, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of background about yourself?
You bet. So as you just mentioned, editor at bearingarms.com, host of the Cam and Company podcast. You can find it on YouTube and Rumble and Apple Podcasts and Amazon and all the rest. Before Bearing Arms, I was the host of Cam and Company on NRA News and then NRA TV from 2004 to 2019. Also a member of the board of the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. And I think that's about it.
And you live in Virginia.
I do live in Virginia. Yes. In fact,
in lovely Farmville. Right?
In fact, I was just thinking about it the other day. So I've now officially lived in Central Virginia longer than I lived in Northern Virginia. I've lived in a rural part of Virginia longer than I lived in the DC suburbs. So I don't think I could be called a DC transplant anymore. I think that's how that works.
Yes, I think that's fair. Pretty different lifestyle down there, I guess, because I'm up in, for any listeners who don't know, I'm up in Alexandria, Virginia, which is Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C. And so Cam is a couple hours away from me down south in a much prettier area of the state. Old Town Alexandria is very nice. This is a much more built up area, though, than as the name implies, than Farmville is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Fairfax County, I think, was 1.8 million people. We moved to a county that was 18,000 people, and about the same size as Fairfax County. So, the population density is a lot less. The traffic's not nearly as bad, although we've had a lot of Amish move into the area. So we actually now we have to watch out for horse and buggies, and that'll slow you down, just like an accident on 495. So, but it has given me, I think, a kind of interesting perspective, because I do have the Northern Virginia experience, but I also now have that experience of living in a very rural community in a much more, red part of the state. Personally, that's been great. I'd love to see, a statewide election where gun owners can actually come out ahead. It's been a long time since that's been the case in Virginia. But this could be the year. This is a fascinating, just, from a political standpoint. I mean, I'm personally invested in this race, too, as a voter and a Virginian, but just from being able to look at it from 30,000 feet. I mean, this is just really a fascinating race because Terry McAuliffe is such an abysmal candidate. And Glenn Youngkin, I've said he's been playing it a little too safe for my liking, but you can't argue with what the polls are saying. I mean, it's, this is, I think, Youngkin's race to lose at this point, a couple of weeks out.
Interesting. You think it's turned that much? Because
I do.
Obviously McAuliffe has been leading probably 5-7 points up to the last, month or so in most polling. But we have seen certainly tightening now, and you've seen a number of polls, not just Republican leaning polls either. In more mainstream polls, you've seen the race at basically a tie at this point. So from your point of view, that's that means that things are actually leaning towards Youngkin a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's breaking towards Youngkin at this point. Unless Terry McAuliffe was able to do something to stop that, I think that independents are going to continue to break for Youngkin. I mean, remember, early voting is already happening right now, so there are people casting a ballot now. If McAuliffe was able to bank a lot of votes early, I mean, maybe that'll be helpful to him, but the way he's running his campaign, I don't think they're confident that they banked many votes at all early on. I think they're still really, really worried about turnout for McAuliffe. And that's why they're bringing in, not just Barack Obama, but they brought in Stacey Abrams. I mean, Terry McAuliffe has been basically running this campaign that, Glenn Youngkin is Donald Trump in a mask. And it's all about, stolen elections and the big lie. And then he brings a woman who believes she's the governor of Georgia to campaign for him in Virginia. I mean, it really is amazing. And I think, while he's trying to get his base of support energized, I think look, I mean, there are conservatives who are going to be energized now because McAuliffe is bringing in Stacey Abrams while he's trying to pretend to be this, moderate, middle of the road candidate.
Yeah, it is funny to watch him do the whole Trump thing with Youngkin, which, to be fair, to me, that is a concern. But I don't love obviously the way that the former President Trump has reacted to losing his election and the lies that he's told about it, and you there's probably some space to go after Youngkin on that front for not being forceful enough and how he's talked about the last election. But the problem is with that tactic, as you just noted here, is that not only did McAuliffe bring in Stacey Abrams, who still holds that she won effectively the Georgia gubernatorial race a couple of years ago when she clearly did not. But McAuliffe himself has questioned the veracity of multiple elections on record and stands by that today. So it's like, okay, you're telling me not to vote for Youngkin because he's not solid enough on accepting the results of elections, but you're doing the same thing. So it's just a very weird strategy that he's employed with regards to that. And that seems to be kind of his main strategy, is just say that Youngkin is Trump. Right. Youngkin is obviously trying to walk this sort of tightrope of keeping Trump at an arm's length, but not going full, anti-Trump by any means. And so, which seems to be working thus far, at least in the polling. Obviously, we'll see how the election turns out. But, in another area, he seems to be walking a tightrope with that I think we'll get a little more in depth on here is guns as well, because you've had Youngkin. There's an interesting dynamic there, too. You've had Youngkin not seek out the endorsements of the NRA, the Virginia Citizens Defense League. He won't fill out their candidate surveys, so he has not been endorsed by either of those groups. While at the same time, he clearly has positions that are a stark contrast with Terry McAuliffe, who is staunchly pro-gun control and wants to implement a new assault weapons ban, and in the past has supported even confiscation of firearms like the AR-15 or the AK-47, whereas Youngkin is opposed to that and has said so on record. So Youngkin is also walking a bit of a tightrope on that issue, and McAuliffe, or at least I guess perhaps McAuliffe's allies in this case, not him directly, have gone after Youngkin for exactly that, but in a way that is fairly underhanded, right? You had a new PAC come in, set up shop in July, pretend that they are some sort of gun rights group, and run a bunch of ads. Actually, I just got one of these ads served to me on Facebook today. It's a Thursday when
my wife got one yesterday.
Yeah. So they're still doing this.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, it's still active. But these ads, they attack Youngkin for not seeking out those endorsements. So they're acting as though they're a pro-gun rights group, but they've been set up and are run by a liberal consulting firm that uses Act Blue, which is the nation's leading progressive fundraising operation, to raise their donations. So clearly what's happening with these ads is disingenuous. They're trying to go after Youngkin from the right on guns. They're targeting Republican areas of the state and Republican leaning, or at least, conservative leaning voters like myself and Miss E down there in Farmville, in a clear attempt to suppress turnout among gun owners and help Terry McAuliffe. Now, interestingly, we found out who was behind these ads, right?
Or at least who was one of the contributors. Yeah, Dominion Energy. And the reason why I found out about this is because they declared this, right? It wasn't that the PAC itself said, okay, Dominion is giving us money. It was Dominion that reported it in their finance reporting. And $200,000 donation to this PAC that, as you say, is designed to depress the turnout of gun owners in Virginia.
Right.
And so
and
when
Dominion,
Yeah.
Dominion is a power company. It's a utility.
Yeah.
It's the largest one in the state.
Exactly. It's a huge energy company. And and so what's interesting is the Democrat running for lieutenant governor, Ayala, I can't remember her first name. She had vowed not to take any money from Dominion, right? Because the left doesn't want to be seen as cozying up to the corporate interests, right? Because they're all about going after Wall Street. Well, she reversed her position after the primary was over and accepted a very, very large donation from Dominion as well. And basically said, yeah, get over it. This isn't a direct donation to McAuliffe.
Right.
But it's in essence, it's an in-kind donation. But the way that, and look, if Dominion was spending $200,000 on ads for Terry McAuliffe, that wouldn't be nearly as big a story.
Or even against Glenn Youngkin just outright.
Right. But
it's the underhanded nature.
But funding ads that are deceptive, right? That's the issue. Because look, like it or not, I mean, you can decide what you want about Glenn Youngkin's decision not to seek the endorsement of the NRA and the VCDL by not filling out their questionnaires.
Right.
But he's answered that question, and that's his response. He says, I didn't fill out anybody's questionnaire. So he said it wasn't, that it wasn't trying to seek the nomination. He said, I just didn't fill out anybody's questionnaire. Again, believe it or not, like it or not, that's his answer.
Yeah. And that's how a lot of these, when they do these sorts of underhanded tactics, which obviously is not the first time that somebody has done this, has funded ads that have nothing to do with their interest because it hurts a candidate they don't like, right? That's not new. It's sleazy. And it's one of those, the combination of sleaziness and commonness is one of the things that turns people off about politics.
Do you remember the American Hunters and Shooters Association?
Yes, this happens with guns quite a lot, right?
It does, right? And so, every election cycle, it seems, somewhere, you get one of these AstroTurf gun groups that pops up and, tries to tell you. What's interesting, though, is that normally in the past, like American Hunters and Shooters Association, they were running ads saying things like, John Kerry is a sportsman and he'll protect your rights. But it generally wasn't attacking the Republican as being soft on guns. Like that, there's an extra layer of crumminess and sleaziness to this beyond just the typical AstroTurf.
Yeah, that's what they'll do is they'll pick something where there's legitimacy to the complaint, right? Because like you said, that it's legitimate for a gun owner or gun rights proponent to make this complaint about Youngkin, to go and say, well, and VCDL has done this. The Virginia Citizens Defense League says, like, well, look, we understand his positions are pro-gun, and he's obviously created a very stark contrast between himself and McAuliffe, who's very pro-gun control. But, if he's not willing to fill out these surveys or, that's going to affect how people view his commitment to this issue. And so you take this legitimate complaint and then you disingenuously forward it with a bunch of money from a power company. And that's where it turns into something that's that a lot of people are probably not going to be responsive to. In fact, all of the comments on the Facebook ad that I was served by the group were wildly negative about the group itself. And it was clear, like the people who commented at least knew what was going on, thanks to the reporting of places like or people like Lachlan Marquet at Axios and you and me and others who've written about it. But it's something that's created backlash too. I wonder if there's a couple things that I wonder about this. First is like, did this hurt them more than it helped? Because like now that everyone knows what they were doing, Dominion's was being protested by Virginia Citizens Defense League, which is one of the groups they were trying to piggyback off of to make these deceptive ads, that only now highlights the stark contrast between McAuliffe and Youngkin on their stated positions on guns.
Yep.
But then the other thing that I think is even perhaps interesting to note here is about Youngkin's strategy itself, this tightrope strategy. Like clearly the analysts who Dominion was willing to back with 6 figures worth of donations determined that this is a weakness for him, that he's not going far enough on this issue, and that leaves him vulnerable with Republican voters in the state. You sort of alluded to this earlier, and I wonder, like, yeah, obviously Dominion and the people behind this consulting firm behind this PAC are doing something underhanded, but I think it's evidence of a miscalculation perhaps on Youngkin's part, or even on McAuliffe's part, for McAuliffe remaining very pro-gun control in his own campaign. It seems like the political analysts out there, at least some of them, think that guns could be a much bigger motivating factor for at least Republican areas of the state if Youngkin were to actually do more with it.
Well, so there's a lot to unpack there. And yes, to that last point, I mean, don't forget, it was, late 2019, early 2020, when we had the Second Amendment sanctuary movement in Virginia. And what was it? 95 counties ended up becoming Second Amendment sanctuaries. You had dozens of towns. I mean, that was less than 2 years ago. And it was a result of the 2019 elections. It was a direct result of Democrats taking control of state government 2 years ago. So why you wouldn't want to remind the voters of what's at stake in those Second Amendment sanctuaries and make that a part of your campaign, I don't know. Unless, Youngkin's advisors are saying it turns off moderates and independents in Fairfax County or the Richmond suburbs.
That seems to be the calculus, right?
Right.
Is that he doesn't want to upset voters in Northern Virginia, which, and that's always the balance when you're running in Virginia, right?
Yeah.
Is that places like Farmville, you might be able to motivate a lot of people with gun rights advocacy there, but places like Arlington, where far more people live, you might turn them off. I don't know. It's interesting, though, because if we're just zooming in on Virginia here, first of all, I mean, it hasn't even actually been 2 years. It's time is obviously a very abstract concept these days after having lived through a pandemic. But the big protest in Richmond, right, that we both attended and covered, and you spoke at, actually, that happened in January 2020.
Yep.
I know it seems like it was much longer ago, but that was the last major political movement in this entire state. I mean, largely because, we've been locked down, and not for the entire 2 years since then, but there hasn't been like a grassroots movement of that nature until really the latest with the school boards protests. Even those are far more limited in scope than what happened with the sanctuary counties movement in Virginia. So it's interesting because Youngkin has seized on the school board protests. That's basically his main issue, but he's effectively ignored the gun rights grassroots movement that came before that. And I do wonder if that is the right calculation. I mean, clearly Dominion and the consulting firm they gave money to don't think so. Or at least they think it leaves him vulnerable with his own turnout on the Republican side.
Well, and that's the thing.
I don't know.
I mean, it is going to be, we say that about every election. It's going to be a turnout election, but they're talking about turnout well under 50%. I mean, in Virginia, this is an off-year election. It's always a struggle to get people to turn out. So voter apathy is a concern, or should be a concern, for both campaigns. Now, ordinarily it would be more of a concern for Glenn Youngkin because, Biden won the state by 10 points. So Terry McAuliffe should have a cushion, right? He should have a margin of apathy. But because he's such a extraordinarily awful candidate, he doesn't have that margin. And because I think Youngkin has run a good campaign. It's not, like I said, it's not necessarily the campaign that I would have run. But the fact that we're seeing these polls where he's tied, where he's ahead by double digits with independents, he's within 4 of Terry McAuliffe among women. That's pretty remarkable. And he's not, as you say, he's walking the tightrope. It's not like Glenn Youngkin's come out and said, well, there's some common sense gun safety reforms I'd like to see in place, but I can't really talk about what those are. No. I think he has managed to. I think you're right. I think he has decided that the gun issue right now is probably not worth bringing up politically because it might motivate Democrats in Northern Virginia. And he probably feels like he does have gun owners pretty well in hand. And I think that's the case because McAuliffe has been outspoken about gun control. He hasn't, held a huge gun control rally or anything of that nature, but he says, yeah, I want to ban AR-15s. Yeah, I want to ban large capacity magazines. You reported on the audio from 2018 or 19?
2019, yeah.
2019, where, gun shows, they're the worst. This was a guy who wanted praise for supposedly saving gun shows and reciprocity the last time he was governor. And now he's told us, that was all BS. It was just what was politically expedient for him at the time. And now it's politically expedient for him to try to go after our guns. And so I think that gun owners are aware. And so you're right. I think that this ultimately was a net negative for the McAuliffe campaign. I think this backfired for him because it did get gun owners talking. So it got us sharing this information with our friends. And maybe we weren't doing that before. But now it gave us something to talk about.
Right.
And, and we're talking about it, as you say. I mean, they're protesting outside of Dominion. So gun owners are now fired up. They are engaged. I think they were going to show up at the polls, but now they might be calling their friends to see if they need a ride,
Right. And I think in this election, with how close it is, even though this has not been the primary focus of either candidate, every little bit is going to matter when an election's down to a couple points. Yeah. Now, I don't want to get people too excited about the outcome of this thing or like be definitive about it, because we have seen this sort of play the last two gubernatorial elections in Virginia, where at the end it tightens and everybody thinks the Republican's going to pull it off. He's doing a little he's right within a couple points. It's closer than it was, and then they lose. Right, that's happened the last two times with Cuccinelli and who was the last one? The last Republican Northam beat. Which tells you how memorable our candidates have been. Right, I can't for the life of me. But either way, so this is sort of a story that's happened. Of course, McDonald pulled it off before McAuliffe. So it's certainly not impossible. The state has obviously changed quite a bit, but it is an off-year election. You have President Biden in office, and his approval ratings have fallen significantly. And so off-year elections like this tend to also have a sort of referendum effect to them on the party that's currently in control of the presidency. And that's the Democrats, and Biden's not doing so hot right now with approval. So that might be dragging down McAuliffe's numbers as well. So there are some factors that point to maybe Youngkin can pull it off. I think him doing so well in Northern Virginia compared to, Cuccinelli or the other losing candidates that Republicans have put up is a big sign that he has a real fighting chance. And certainly McAuliffe's become a lot more desperate in his rhetoric recently. And Biden is coming out to Arlington, I guess, was just reported recently here. So he's still trying to bring in as many big names as he can. Actually, I wanted to real quick. You touched on the 2019 comments from McAuliffe. One of the interesting things to me in those comments that hasn't gotten a ton of attention is, he describes the 2016 deal that was made over gun carry reciprocity, over concealed carry reciprocity for people coming from other states that have concealed carry permits, them being valid in Virginia. Mm-hmm. In 2016, after they had failed to capture control of the state house, despite millions of dollars worth of donations from gun control advocacy groups and Michael Bloomberg, it seemed like how that all went down, and you were following it at the time, just like I was that Mark Herring, who's still the Attorney General today and is actually running for re-election, and why this point I think really matters, he unilaterally did away with all of our reciprocity deals, which made it illegal for anyone to carry a handgun concealed in Virginia if they were from out of state, even if they had a permit from their home state, right? And this was a huge deal at the time.
Oh, yeah, because a lot of other states canceled their reciprocity with Virginia. Right. And so all of a sudden now Virginians couldn't carry in North Carolina. So, I mean, you had, you know, a lot of people who live along these borders who all of a sudden were completely screwed because of what Herring did. Yeah. Right.
And or Pennsylvania, where I'm from. And it personally affected me in that regard. It was very annoying. And then Pennsylvania's AG did the same thing and got rid of. We still don't have reciprocity with Pennsylvania, unfortunately, which is very annoying for me personally, if anyone cares. So he that backfired horribly at the time and led to the legislature, which was controlled by Republicans, passing a bill or introducing bills to override what the Attorney General wanted to do with reciprocity. Because this is, first of all, this has never been done before. No Attorney General had done anything like this. It wasn't like something that was normal, or this is like a fairly extreme, like technically he had the power to do this, but no one else had ever tried something like that before. The power is supposed to be like the Attorney General is supposed to go out and make these deals, not break all of them unilaterally on his own. That was never the intention behind him having that power. So it pissed off a lot of people, as you noted there. And so what ended up happening was there was horrible backlash. They were going to pass these laws and they were going to have a veto-proof majority, was the rumor, at least at the time. So McAuliffe couldn't do anything to stop them from putting this in law. So instead, he made this deal where we got universal recognition of all out-of-state concealed carry permits in exchange for prohibition on essentially people who have domestic violence related restraining orders against them have to turn in their firearms, which is not a controversial position. Like the VCDL supported that. The deal was not in any way viewed as much of a compromise. It was definitely a win for gun rights groups. But McAuliffe tries to spin this in his 2019 comments as him like making, the first he says the Attorney General did this and it gave him leverage to make this deal, which is a wild distortion of the reality of what happened. But the more interesting part of it to me was that he admits in those comments that Herring did this, unilaterally removed these reciprocity deals, while knowing that nobody had ever come into Virginia. According to McAuliffe, no one had ever come into Virginia with an out-of-state license and hurt anyone. And they apparently knew this, and he's openly talking about this in 2019. So this move was done completely for political reasons and not out of any sense of, safety concerns.
Right.
And that is interesting to me because Herring is running for re-election, even though Herring was the other state official who had a blackface controversy, who admitted that he too wore blackface in college, just like current Governor Ralph Northam did. And so, which is also probably why they needed McAuliffe to come back and run again, because their top three guys in state government here for the Democrats all basically got tarnished for life by terrible scandals, although none of them resigned over them. You had Northam did blackface, Herring did blackface, and then the lieutenant governor was accused of sexual misconduct as well.
Yeah. But, I think in a way, I think that you're right. I think the Democrat establishment was probably very happy to see McAuliffe come back. But, Doug Wilder, who was the first black governor of Virginia, has been very critical of Terry McAuliffe because McAuliffe said at the time of Northam and Herring's blackface scandals that they should resign. And now he's campaigning with them. He's standing side by side, Mark Herring. And Doug Wilder has criticized McAuliffe for that. He accused McAuliffe of jumping in line ahead of black female legislators who were running for the governorship. And if McAuliffe hadn't been in the race, the Democrats probably would have nominated a black woman as their candidate. So that's one of the reasons why you're seeing Kamala Harris and why you're seeing Stacey Abrams and why you're seeing, women of color, politicians of color coming to Virginia now, because McAuliffe is very concerned about whether or not black Democrats are going to turn out to vote for him or black independents. And, the other person on the ballot who rarely, if ever, gets mentioned is a woman named Princess Blanding, who is running as the Liberation Party candidate, not the Libertarian Party candidate, but the Liberation Party candidate to Terry McAuliffe's left. But she is the sister of Marcus Peters, who was killed by the Richmond police. She is, very well known in social justice circles. There's no way she's winning, but every vote she gets is probably a vote taken away from Terry McAuliffe. McAuliffe is really concerned that if they're at 46-46, what happens if Princess Blanding gets 3% of the vote or 4% of the vote? Or 5% of the vote. And so you're right about McAuliffe's desperation, but I think a lot of it is structural. Like I said, I think he's an awful politician, but I think he was the wrong candidate for the Democrats this year. And I think that Glenn Youngkin has turned out to be, if not the right candidate, a right candidate, because I think he's done what he has needed to do to keep this race close. He has been able to capitalize on McAuliffe's, and I think it's ultimately going to come down to, if McAuliffe loses, it's going to be that statement that parents shouldn't have a say in what their kids learn in school.
All right. So bottom line, you think that Youngkin is in a position to win now, and McAuliffe is the one who's scrambling to catch up at this point, basically.
Yeah, I do think that's the dynamic of the race at the moment. I mean, I think that this is now Youngkin's race to lose. I still think it's going to be close. I think it's going to be fluid, but I think the energy right now is with Youngkin, and I think Terry McAuliffe is flailing. And like we talked about, I mean, there are just some structural problems with McAuliffe's candidacy that I think are going to make it really difficult for him to pull it out. But, bottom line, I mean, look, if gun owners stay home in Virginia on Election Day, we're only going to have ourselves to blame. If we turn out, if we show up, I think that we've got a chance to defeat Terry McAuliffe's gun ban. I think we've got a chance to block any new gun control laws. But, again, for both sides, it's going to come down to who turns out, who shows up.
Yeah. And I think if Youngkin pulls off an upset here, that's going to be a big deal.
It's going to be a huge deal.
That's going to say a lot. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, this is a Biden plus 10 state at this point, and a Republican winning state. Now, obviously, it's not unheard of, but Virginia's been trending blue ever since the last Republican governor we had almost a decade ago. What was it? More than a decade ago at this point, right?
Yeah.
2013. So just under a decade ago, I guess 9 years ago.
Yeah. But it's been more than a decade since we've elected one. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, that'll be interesting. And I really do think that you're right about the gun implications here, the implications of this Dominion story, and how it's probably backfired a lot at this point from what I've seen. And, it's hard to know without polling, but it does feel like guns have become a much more salient issue at the very end of this race and could motivate a number of people to turn out. And in a race this close, that could matter a lot. But thanks for coming on. Tell the people where they can find more of you.
You bet. You can find more of me at bearingarms.com. Also, just look up Bearing Arms Cam and Company on YouTube or Rumble or all of the podcast platforms, and you can find us there. And if you want some non-two-way stuff, you can also visit my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/Cam Edwards. Miss E and I do a fairly irregular podcast called Foul Language, FOWL, although it is uncensored. And I've just started doing another podcast called the Reading Rabbit Hole, in which I go through some really obscure bits of American history that I've come across in my reading. So there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You'll have to update us on what it's like to live with the Amish, because I have to tell you, as someone who's lived next to Lancaster County for most of his life, that the buggy traffic is very annoying.
Buddy, I got to tell you, I mean, like, this is
very annoying.
We just had a horrible accident in the next county over. both parents were killed. 6 kids were injured. All of them Amish in a buggy. And part of it is because we have had a lot of Amish move in over the last few years, and people don't know how to drive around we're still driving like they don't exist.
Right. You got to be careful.
Absolutely.
Especially those are all back roads that they're driving their buggies on. It's not,
and you can come up on them real fast. Yeah. It can
go from annoying to dangerous very fast.
Yep. Absolutely. But
the Walmart by my mom actually has a stable in the parking lot for people to park their horses.
Really?
Their shop. Yes.
Oh, that might be.
Because it's not just Amish, right? That do that. You got Mennonites. There's sort of a spectrum that sort of lifestyle out there, so they don't all necessarily shun shopping at Walmart or whatever.
They need a flag.
Yeah.
Hand sewn, of course. Right.
There you go. Nice. I've always found, this is getting way off track, but I've always found the whole Amish thing in southeastern Pennsylvania is very much a marketing scam 99% of the time. People like to just slap Amish made or whatever on everything and just pretend that. Well,
because there it is.
Tourist garbage.
I was going to say there it's a huge tourism industry. Yeah. And we haven't had that pop up yet. We only have, we have the authentic Amish industries. Next time I come on, I'll tell you about the Amish guy who occasionally calls me on my cell phone, which I didn't realize you were supposed to do. But I
think there's a whole spectrum there. It's not
a lot of loopholes, a lot of right. Yeah, the gun control lobby would love the Amish because there's so many loopholes to close.
There's it's that's to each their own, I guess. As far I don't want to lose my Amish listenership here by being too harsh on them. But
you are the Dave Chappelle of the Amish, Stephen Gutowski.
I just
when they hear about this,
it's not as romantic as it seems. But hey, that's their right to live the way they want.
Exactly.
Just be careful when you're driving out in Lancaster County or now
Central Virginia. Yeah, exactly right. Well, hey man, thanks for the invite. This is always fun. We got to get you back on Bearing Arms Cam and Company.
Yes, absolutely. We will do that very soon. Thanks for coming on, and we'll have you back on here again because I've always enjoyed talking to you.
Anytime.
And that's all we've got for this week's episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. If you enjoyed it, the number one thing you can do to help us out is go ahead and rate or review the podcast on whatever app you're listening to it on. Like it on Facebook, share it, spread the joy around. And we will see you again next week. You can also obviously buy a membership. That's a really big help, in directly funding the Reload. It's an independent publication that does not receive any sort of backing from any gun groups or any one that would provide any sort of conflict of interest. It's 100% reader funded at this point, and we need those memberships to survive because we are 100% accountable to you guys, the readers, the listeners. Now, if you want to be a part of that, if you want to help make this all possible, you can head on over to thereload.com today and buy a membership. But until next time, I'm Stephen Gutowski, and I will see you again soon.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend, now there's none. I made the devil run. I broke so many bones.